Okay, so we've kind of explained that there's this paradox, especially using China as an example, let's say, where there's a push towards kind of a cashless society, which in many ways is more efficient, but it also means it's more difficult for certain people to access that cashless society, right? Yeah. So in the case of, let's say, the poor, the elderly, there's reports now coming out of China that some of them are actually having difficulty accessing the information technology or this digital kind of cashless system. So what do you think? Now, conversely, I guess just to lay the table even more completely, you may not realize that there's actually the opposite thing happening in other more developed parts of the world, the US as an example. So very advanced cities of New York, Philadelphia, I think Boston and Massachusetts, they actually have the exact opposite rules. They actually have laws that say a store or a vendor must accept cash. And the reasons why they say they must accept cash is because if they don't, then it would make it difficult for the poor, let's say, to access those commodities, right? And in fact, those laws stem back all the way to the 1970s when credit cards first came around, right? So you have this kind of dichotomy where on the one hand it's more efficient, maybe even safer, but on the other hand, it kind of excludes people. What do we do about this?
Well, me personally, I think from both a practical perspective as well as perhaps more of a kind of a normative perspective, I think it's difficult to envision a situation where you go completely cashless in a lot of places, partly because of the inclusion kind of issues that you raised initially in your question. But from a practical perspective I don't think governments are incentivized to say, hey, we don't want you to accept, or we wanted to make it okay to not accept legal tender to satisfy bills. And I think that's a challenge when it comes to these kind of things. So fundamentally, I think there's a government incentive to encourage cash payments, or at least as an option. So I don't think these are necessarily mutually exclusive. I think as a package, they need to be considered together.
As an interesting side note, I mean, one of the examples that we've provided in this is the idea that for tourists, for example, right? If I was to go to China, as you and I have, or if we go to Myanmar, other locations, just as a tourist, whether you're rich or not, you can have difficulty accessing the economy. I'm curious, like, in a cashless society, how would a tourist access that market? I mean, I don't really know. Is there a solution to that?
Well, I don't know either. I mean, I think there are parts, we try to access it in countries that have fairly financial systems that are fairly consistent or linked to each other. We get around that just by using credit cards, right?
Sure.
And so these are, anywhere you go, it's pretty much okay.
And those are those stickers on the back that show like Union Pay or whatever, saying they're like
you can use them globally in whatever their network. I guess the problem is, even in many respects, China is part of that network. However, an example that we had last year was, even in a brand new mall, they wouldn't take a credit card. And so if you start removing payment options, cash, even cards, and go completely digital, like using basically devices, then that becomes a problem, right? And then you start cutting off people, perhaps. And from a holistic perspective, maybe you're okay to say, hey, we don't really care if people like you who are only here for like 2 or 3 days are integrated into the system or not. And that's a judgment that certain financial ecosystems and countries can make. And I don't think we're in a place to tell them to change. But I think it's worth a question, and it's worth kind of thinking about, like we're doing.
Yeah, and so maybe for all of us, we're actually asking the wrong question and looking at this from the wrong perspective, right? Because in reality, we're asking this question from the perspective of people that currently use cash and have used cash. But if the problem is access to that digital technology that allows you to have digital payments, maybe we should be looking at it from the perspective or asking the question, if it's that important, should the government actually provide a digital device to every single person, right? So just like the idea of being regarded as a utility because it's so critical, maybe there's a government-issued smartphone, right? That everyone would have and therefore have access to these economies. Who knows what's going to happen in the future? Clearly, that's not going to happen now. But I think that may, at some point, if it truly is a cashless society, you'd have to have the technology to catch up to that. Otherwise, that culture lag would mean that potentially a large percentage of your population would not have access to that cashless society.
And I think if we, in some far-off future, if we actually move to that, then we'd have to think about occasions where we would need contingencies, where in large natural disaster, electricity's out. I mean, then how would
which is true for cash, by the way, because again, banks are like IT firms essentially. If there's a big power outage, or if you couldn't access, the bank, money, which a lot of it's not physical currency, the same thing can happen.
Yeah. But which is why I think in the face of those kind of disasters, people will go to a bank and pull cash out prior to a large hurricane coming, go stock up on food.
Yeah.
It will kind of do this as a precaution measure. And, kind of in an extreme sense, there are still people in the world who still stockpile a little gold at home just in case they need to, try to escape or something, happens. And I've run into people who live in fairly developed places that still
gold coins,
have little
coins.
gold bars, gold coins, different things that they can use in case in a contingency situation. So I think we'd have to account for that as a society before we kind of move down that path.
Yeah, great.